Welcome everybody to the first edition of 2024 Glacier Book Club. Doug Mitchell here. It is, as always, my great pleasure to be with you as the Executive Director of the Glacier National Park Conservancy. I'm joined tonight, as always, by the best team in the business. Andrew and Gracie and Amy and Sean are going to help us walk through the first book club of a new year. And thank you all so much for your support. I couldn't be more excited by this one. I did have to do some explaining to some people about, so a political biography, crime story, Glacier Park helped me out here. Well, Burton K. Wheeler, who is right over my shoulder here, is a very important part, as everyone here knows, of Glacier Park's history. And this remarkable book we're going to share tonight is really also a part of our rich history at Glacier by extension. So let me start by introducing our guest. In addition to managing public programming at the University of Southern California Go Trojans Libraries, Nathan Masters is the host of the Los Angeles Emmy Award-winning public television series Lost LA. You can see the Emmy Award right there over his right shoulder. Congratulations. He's published hundreds of articles about Los Angeles history, and his true life long-form story about America's first policewoman, Pillars of Fire, is currently under development at Amazon Studios as a feature film. Published in March of last year, the work we'll be talking about tonight, Crooked, the Roaring Twenties Tale of a Corrupt Attorney General, a Crusading Senator, and the Birth of the American Political Scandal, is his first book and was just last week nominated for an Edgar Allan Poe Award from the National Mystery Writers of America in the Best Crime category, if I'm not mistaken. He is joining us and lives in the mountains of Southern California with this bio description, and does not sleep. And he lives there with his wife, the author and television writer, Ksenia Melnick, and their two kids. So thank you, Nathan, for taking the time out to join us.
Well, thanks, Doug. It's an honor to be with you and be able to talk about the book with everyone, including the Wheeler grandchildren. I really can't wait to hear if they have anything to add.
We have already invited Nathan up for a visit. So if you're up to accompany him to the cabin, send us a chat and we'll put you on the list and we'll get a little group going. And we'll get out to the cabin and show him that very, very special piece of real estate. So thanks again for being with us. This is this is a little bit of for us, as I said, it's a little bit of a stretch. Mm-hmm. But walk us through, tell us a little bit more about what is a librarian doing, messing around with political history.
Right. Well, I should say, first of all, I'm not a librarian. So I sort of work on the other side of the libraries, just in the public programs. In my show Lost LA is an extension of that, trying to raise awareness about library collections and tell people about how they're still valuable to understanding, the city we live in today or the society we live in today. So that work that I do with Lost LA, which is trying to find compelling stories in the archives, often untold or forgotten stories, that has a lot to do with the book that I eventually wrote. What am I doing telling a political story? I wanted to challenge myself after doing so much around Los Angeles. I decided to get out of my comfort zone and do a national political thriller. I'm really happy I did. Wanted to broaden my horizons.
So how did you find Wheeler?
Yeah, so I came to Wheeler sort of through the back door. I started thinking, this was around 2018, 2019. I was trying to find a story that might have some modern day resonance. And so, at the time, there was a lot of the presidential administration was embattled by corruption scandals. So I was trying to think, are there any precedents for this? Well, of course there are, right? Like almost every presidency at some point has some sort of corruption scandal. But I was drawn to the administration of Warren Harding, probably one of the most corrupt administrations in U.S. history, although we don't need to get into it. But Harding himself, there's really no evidence that he was personally complicit in any of the corruption. In fact, the Department of Justice looked into it. I found this in the National Archives and basically cleared him. Like they were ready to, I mean, he was dead, but they were ready to call him out for corruption. But since there was nothing there with Harding himself, I started to look around his administration, and I came across the story of this attorney general, who is, of course, he's charged with upholding and enforcing the laws of the United States, and yet he was basically doing the opposite. He was enriching himself by breaking the law. I thought that was fascinating, but then when I really knew there was a story there or a book there, when I found out that there was this crusading freshman senator from Montana, just elected to the Senate, who decides to go after Doherty, and then when he just as he closes in on the truth, and he comes under under indictment himself, right? He's in the crosshairs of the Doherty regime. I thought that was an interesting story. This sort of revenge enacted on him by the Justice Department.
And it doesn't hurt that you also have a mysterious death of a Doherty hanger-on, right?
Yes,
that adds a little, espionage twist to it.
Yeah. I wanted
to start the book with right there, right?
I do. I mean, I wanted to. It's obviously it's a nonfiction, it's a narrative nonfiction book. It's a history book,
right.
But I wanted to structure it as much as I could like a mystery novel. And a good mystery novel is going to start with a dead body.
as it should.
Right.
So you make this link. I think we all know Teapot Dome, but the Doherty story is adjacent, but different. You, I think you spent probably months, right, in the archives and looking through documents. Did you know right away you had a story, or did it take you some time to say, yeah, there's enough fact here that I can put this together?
I knew right away. I forget exactly what book it was. I think it was a history of the FBI. I knew I was interested in the origins of the FBI and the origins of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI specifically, right? Because one of the ironies of this book is that Wheeler cleans up the Department of Justice, but one of the consequences of that is that Hoover's left in control of the FBI, and we kind of know how that all turned out. Obviously, I should say, like, the FBI is a completely different institution today, and I have a lot of respect for the law enforcement work that they do. But I was reading a history, I think it was like the 1950 Max Lowenthal history. It was a very critical look at the FBI, and one of the episodes that was chronicled in that book was the Doherty's campaign of persecution against Wheeler. And it's just too good of a story where, the investigator then becomes investigated, right? The investigated. And I had to do a quick check of the archival records. I saw that thankfully the Wheeler family in decades past had donated copious materials to Montana State University, and I'm not sure how it all ended up, but also at the Montana State Archives. So I knew there was going to be enough material there. Plus, in addition to that, there's the Department of Justice records at the National Archives and the FBI files. Couldn't have written the book without that. Plus a lot of great collections at the Library of Congress. But it was a simple task of just checking on my computer, looking at the archival finding aids to make sure that there was the material to tell that story in detail, right? Because I needed facts to make it like a really compelling tale. But I knew right away. Didn't take a lot of convincing.
So it's interesting that there is so much information out there about this period of time, and it's great to have those archives. I think one of the things we are working on right now at the Glacier Conservancy is the park archives are very valuable, but they're also under-resourced, and you probably see that in your world as well. That
everywhere, yeah, yeah.
And so it's work that we're probably, and pre-warning our donor group on the phone, you're probably going to hear, or on Zoom, probably going to hear from us about that, because the park archives is located fundamentally in the former dormitory building. It still has one of the kind of cook vents in it. And that's hard for researchers, right? Who need to go into those. So you'll be hearing more from me about that in the future. So let's make sure Amy Lucky is going to curate questions. So feel free to throw questions in the chat. We're also going to have a kind of poll question for all of you here in the middle a bit. As you know, those of you who know me well know that I'm kind of a political junkie, so I could talk to Nathan all night long about all of this. I wanted to kind of ask you, so you had all this material. What's the best story that didn't get in the book?
Well, I think it revolved around Gaston Means, who's probably my favorite character in the book. He was a real scoundrel. For the folks who haven't read the book, Gaston Means was an undercover, back then it was the Bureau of Investigation. It later became the FBI, but undercover Bureau of Investigation operative hired by its director, Billy Burns, basically to carry out dirty deeds for Harry Doherty and the Harding administration. I mean, he was probably the most unprincipled man to ever carry a badge for the federal government. He had served during World War I, had served as a spy for for Germany, for the German Kaiser. Until, I mean, he did resign as soon as the U.S. entered the war, but he tried to smuggle copper and other supplies over to Germany through a front organization. He was accused credibly of murdering a widow from whom he stole $100,000. Back then was quite a sum.
Yeah.
And yet, after all that, Billy Burns, the director of the Bureau of Investigation, gave him a badge. So my favorite story was about, in fact, the whole first, I'd say, quarter of the book, I ended up not writing. I had outlined it all, but I figured out that I was starting the story the real story started sort of a quarter of the way into the book. But there was this whole storyline about Gaston Means conning people out of money. He was a con man in addition to everything else. And he sort of posed as the Harding administration's approved fixer when he was actually not. He didn't really have those connections, but he took people's money, promised them that, for instance, he'd get liquor out of government bonded warehouses during Prohibition, right? Promised people that he could make indictments go away. And he had no authority to do that. And the Attorney General himself, Harry Doherty, did get involved in some of that stuff later on, and he actually did have the power to do that. But there was this whole storyline around that, and J. Edgar Hoover trying to eventually he came under suspicion. J. Edgar Hoover trying to track him down. It was a fun tale, but didn't make the cut.
So, how does writing a book, kind of, and researching a book differ from your other work, like with Lost LA? I mean, it seems like they're very, very disparate types of work.
Well, they are, and personally, for me, it's the fact that when I write the book, I am just alone for hours and hours working on this, and the TV shows is just a collaborative thing, from the conception of the episodes, of course, to post production. We have just an amazing team behind that, and I just get to be the face of the show, really. But when it's the book, I'm in the archives on my own. I'm pecking away at the keyboard on my own. That's really the biggest difference. And it's just when we do these episodes, they're 26 and a half minutes. That really limits what you can tell, the scale and the scope of the story you can tell. And there's a virtue in that, right? Like, forces you to be economical in your storytelling. But with a book, you can really tell a long, sustained rip-roaring tale.
Yeah, and we'll put a link to Lost LA in the chat for people. And we sent out in the reminder yesterday a link to one of the stories, and we talked a little bit about this, Nathan, before we started. That you recently have done a piece that really could have fundamentally been done here in Glacier about Native people, Indigenous people being in the landscape in LA and the hiking trails. Talk to us a little bit about that and how that came about, because that's a really interesting adjacency to the work that we do and the experiences we all have as glacier lovers.
Yeah, I mean that's the story really of the American West, right? Is later arrivals to the region or to these areas have you know they've told their own history about the place, their own stories about the place, but those stories often exclude the people who had been here for thousands and thousands of years. And yeah, this was an episode that we just did about the history of hiking in Southern California. And you know, there's a lot of like we sort of have our own style of hiking. It's not really what you do in Montana. It's people in Lululemon and athleisure hiking up these chaparral hills. But it's our own style of hiking. Of course, a lot of us, I mean, myself included. Sorry, I'm going out of focus here. I don't, my camera's malfunctioning. Try to stay a little bit further away. You know, a lot of us in LA do love to drive up to Yosemite or hike through Joshua Tree, and we have plenty of national parks at our disposal. But we looked into the long history of hiking, and yeah, we had this great segment with a local indigenous scientist and artist who talked about how these trails go back millennia. They were used by her ancestors who needed access to special plants that only grew like in the foothills or up in the mountains, and how they maintained this landscape that when the first white settlers came, they just sort of assumed it was untended and they called it wilderness, but that left out a lot of history.
Yeah, and you also I don't remember if it was in this one or in another episode, you got to spend some time with Shelton Johnson and Yosemite, yeah, who's really quite an amazing and charismatic leader in this movement.
Yeah, I spent a couple hours with him, and boy, those were some special hours. He really is an inspirational person. He's done a lot of great research just on his own. I think writing stories about the buffalo soldiers in the national parks. But he had. I mean, I'm sure most of most of the folks here have seen the Ken Burns series on the national parks, and I think he sort of stole the show in that series. So it was a real treat to get to talk to him more about national parks and what they mean.
It's and I'm kind of wrapping around to a vision that you write about in the book, that when Walsh and Wheeler are back at their places, there's kind of people would come to Lake McDonald in the 1920s, I think 20s, and they would say, "Where are you going?" Because you had to be driven there, and they'd say, "I'm going to see the senator," and they would say, "Which one?"
Right.
And because Walsh and Wheeler both had homes, and there's a part in your book where Wheeler clearly knows he's under the microscope. He needs his senior senator's advice, and they go on a walk on the shore of Lake McDonald. Mm-hmm. When you wrote that, could you see that in your mind? I know you've not been to Glacier yet, but could you kind of see that?
Yeah, I mean, I always look up photographs of the locations I'm writing about. Yeah, and I could, and isn't that just sort of like a touching scene and thought that yeah, that two senators could just work out a big problem taking a walk along a national park lake.
Yeah, and it's really what we're all about right now as we work on this project to restore the cabin and to fulfill the legacy of Wheeler, to create a place where people can come together in small groups. It's a small cabin, so this is something that's going to be day use for say 15 or 20 people, right? But that they can have that moment together. And kind of as you think about that, is it lost, or is there still hope that can still be part of our narrative as we think about public discourse and bringing people together?
I don't know. Should we just give every United States senator a cabin on a lake, and have? I mean, I've heard worse ideas. I mentioned that I had cut out a lot of the first part of the book, or at least what I planned for the book. There was actually a scene that took place at that cabin. I think it was where Wheeler was persuaded, or where he decided to run for the Senate in 1922. I mean, I had a lot more said in Montana, including his 1920 gubernatorial campaign, where he was nearly lynched by a mob that was riled up by the copper monopoly. And he went back to Montana, kind of licking his wounds. He got into a fist fight on the streets of Butte, which was was interesting, but maybe not entirely out of character. And then he was spending a peaceful summer on the lake. Maybe it was 1921. It must have been 1921. And I think he caught wind of maybe the start of a corruption scandal from Washington. And then his supporters came to him and were encouraging him to run for the Senate. And I think his wife, Lulu Wheeler, said, "You're not really going to run for office again, right? Like, don't you know?" But he decided to do it, and it was there, I believe, that it happened, and that set this amazing senatorial career in motion.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, Amy Lucky, we've got a couple of questions in there, and then I'm going to kind of launch a request if there's a Wheeler grandchild or great grandchild who might want to weigh in and say hello and kind of give a little background here, that would be a lot of fun. So pop me or Amy a chat that we can call on you. But you've got a couple questions I know in there, Amy.
I do, and I've already messaged with Robin a little bit, and I think she's gonna read her comment out loud here in a minute. So that'll be a good. Robin is Perfect. One of the Wheeler grandchildren. So Nathan, I just wanted to share with you some of the comments, because this does not always happen, but as soon as the conversation started, all of a sudden people were just putting in comments about the book and how much they enjoyed it. So I encouraged them to share more. But Kathy Wyatt says, really fascinating, great choice for the start of this book club season. Victoria agreed. She also would like to go to the cabin, as would lots of people. Cheryl Taylor says, I never would have picked up this book, honestly, but I absolutely loved it, and she'll be spreading the word with friends. Susan King said, I agree. For me, it was even more fascinating having attended a special exhibit at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library about the FBI. It was one of those books that she just could not put down. So just, yeah, Sarah says, I love this book, page turner from the beginning. Just goes on and on. Cheryl and our good friend Kay Stone also, they would have loved to see more photos in the book, or some photos in the book, that they wanted to see who the characters were. I'm sure you can go and Google that, but that was a couple comments they made. So did you think about doing that?
Yeah, I did. I had some conversations with my editor about that, and we decided not to do it. It was a mistake, probably. We were thinking, of course, that, given the age we live in, it's pretty easy to just Google a lot of these characters, and at the very least, we had the two main characters on the cover. But yeah, we really, especially given that most of these photos now are in the public domain, we really should have done it. So I'm sorry.
A good way to save space. Yes, people know how to Google. And Dave agreed to unmute, Dave Baylor, and share his comment with you, Nathan.
Hi, Nathan. I'm enjoying the book so far. I asked for it from the Seattle Public Library, and I just got it yesterday, so I'm reading as fast as I can, but I really enjoy your style, and I just appreciate that. When you started talking about your research process, it immediately reminded me of my conversations with Ivan Doig over here while he was still. And the fact that one of my favorite books of his was called The Sea Runners. And he said, yeah, I discovered that by stumbling upon a yellow newspaper clipping about guys washing ashore down on the Washington coast at the end of the 1800s. And that triggered research and an entire writing of one of my favorite books. He was surprised I'd read it because nobody else apparently has read it, that book. But so I was intrigued by the fact that you're sifting through and you find something, and all you need is a scintilla of an idea, and then you chase after it. And there's so much available. So I really appreciated your research process.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that. And yeah, the best advice that I've heard for researching a book comes from one of my favorite authors, sort of the master of the true crime narrative nonfiction story, Eric Larson. You know, he wrote like Devil in the White City is probably his most famous book. And he says, and I have to say, like the phase I've now left it, but for a while I was in this weird phase where I was done with one book and I needed to find another. And it's just agonizing, right? But the best advice I heard from Eric Larson was read promiscuously, and you just read, and eventually you'll find inspiration. You can't really look for it with intent. It'll come to you as long as you're exposing yourself to new ideas and new facts.
Yeah. And Eric's book on the Lusitania and on Churchill, the same kind of thing, you know, just open up that file and see where it takes you. So I appreciate you doing that. I like your writing style too. It's engaging. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, for being here and for sharing. Robin, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and sharing your comment as well.
Sure. So I'm the great granddaughter of Senator Wheeler. I think my mother's on the phone and some of my cousins, maybe my aunt. So it's like a little family reunion. It's very nice. Thank you, Doug, for hosting this. You know, we've all been reading it and very honored to have the author himself here. This is really special for us. Sorry, there's my clock. It's the stroke of 9 back east here. I'm in Florida. But so I'll just read my comment. And I wrote, agreed, this was a great piece of writing on an important time in history and made me proud to be the great granddaughter of B.K. Wheeler of Montana, who was brave enough to take on an entire system to do the right thing, especially when the deck was stacked against him. I mean, that's what struck me. Like, he had so much courage. I didn't really actually quite realize the amount of courage he had, but in the way you told the story, I mean, when literally every door is closing in your face, everything around you is saying, you know, you're so small and insignificant, and we are the whole system. And to persevere really was, you know, made me proud. And I think that's a lot of Montana spirit in him. He was not deterred. In fact, I think he was, you know, ignited to keep going.
Well, thank you, Robin. I should say the honor is all mine, and I guess I regret that I haven't had a chance to talk to any of the Wheeler family. I purposefully decided not to reach out to any of the family member, any of the descendants, because I believe in the documentary record, and I know how stories can sort of morph in the telling over the years. But and thankfully the family has endowed those two places with amazing.
So glad I send my check in every year to the MSU Rennie Library. Thank God it's getting used.
It really is, and there's
Yeah.
a big bust of the senator in there too, which I did snap a selfie with. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a true David and Goliath tale, and you know, David won. But it took a lot of courage. He was going against Washington's most ruthless political operator, who had all of the powers of the Justice Department at his disposal. And he knew from his experience, you know, as a U.S. attorney, standing up to you know, the wartime hysteria, and then standing up to the copper monopoly. He knew how dangerous that could be, and yet he was committed to doing the right thing.
Thank
Super
you.
interesting. I know that Tyler Scott is also on the phone. I want to just give Tyler a shout out. He has volunteered countless hours to stand by my side, helping kind of do the. Tyler is thinks he's a retired architect. I think I've unretired him. So thank you, Tyler, for all of that, and we're looking forward to what we hope is the beginning of the construction this year. And it's really exciting. I get more and more excited about this project every time we get close to it, and this is really helping that as well. So Amy, what else you got for us? If you don't have any other questions, I have a question for all of the book clubbers.
Why don't we go with yours, and I'll kind of regroup in my questions, make sure I haven't
Right,
left
so
it. I know there's a couple more, but you go ahead.
If you want to launch our, we have a survey, so you're going to be asked, the question is, other than Senator Wheeler, who is your favorite character in the book?
You don't have the lady, she, Jess Smith's wife.
There you go. So click other for us, and we'll,
Okay.
yeah. So look at that.
Name.
There is, there is this great comment here about Roxy Stinson, and that's absolutely right.
Roxy.
Yeah, she, she's interesting. It's really hard to track down information on her because she really did shun the spotlight, and she just faded into normal life. She she was on the huge political stage for several weeks in 1924, and then she remarried and lived a normal life until I think the late 60s, 1970. And it was only then some obituaries that sort of resurrected her role in this tale.
Yeah, so many great characters. Have been a very long list, so I just chose some of the major ones. But how about some other people who have other? If you since other is the clear winner here, um, uh, give us a couple of people, unmute or give us a quick chat about who else caught your fancy in the book. I think it's kind of fun as an author to hear from people about which people really really caught people's interest.
I like
I love it. Yeah.
Coolidge.
Oh,
I
yeah.
thought he was a great character. And I have to say, this book was amazing. I am not one to pick up a book like this off the shelf. Usually they're just like reading the Encyclopedia Britannica. There's a lot of facts and no character, but this was so fleshed out. I loved it. It was just, you're really a great writer. I just loved it.
Oh, well, thank you. That means a lot. Yeah, I definitely, I was always focused on trying to make it, a compelling read, a page turner, if you will.
You succeeded.
Well, thanks. Yeah. Oh, and what you said about Coolidge is absolutely right. I felt the same way. Like going into writing the book, I didn't know much about him. I knew like he famously slept 10 hours a day and like took a 2-hour nap in the middle of the day. I didn't know much more about him, but boy, he was an interesting guy, and also quite principled, right? With not what you'd expect from a national politician, but yeah, fascinating guy.
Any other people brave enough? Thank you, Roberta. Anybody else brave enough to unmute and tell us another other favorite?
Lots of votes for Roxy, for sure, in the comments.
So interesting question, Amy, from Victoria.
Let me scroll down to Victoria.
Asking about whether you have a documentary, any evidence about whether Doherty and Smith were a couple.
Yeah, that it was like a different time where people wouldn't write about that. It was generally assumed, and there's some sort of oblique references to that. They certainly lived an alternative lifestyle. Was it ever an issue? I'm seeing this here. Was it ever an issue at the time? It really wasn't. And Senator Wheeler could have gone there, right? He could have made an issue. And I think at one point there was a veiled reference to that, right? Like when Doherty had gone after Roxy Stinson personally and had presented this evidence that she had been having an affair, Wheeler said, it's unfair for you to go into the witness's private life. We could go there too. We're not going to, but we could go there too. And I think that's what he was gesturing at. But that was probably one of the more difficult parts of the book was trying to tiptoe around that without, I couldn't say anything definitive about whether they were gay, but just trying to lay out the facts there as I found them.
Well, think of some more questions. I promised everyone, and Nathan was very kind to agree to do book plates. So if you'd like a signed book plate, we will. You can put that in the chat, or you can email Gracie@glacier.org, and we'll take care of that. We'll get it down to Nathan, and he'll sign them and send them back to us, and we'll get them out to you. Thank you, Nathan, for doing that. It's awesome, very appreciated by people. I also we are acclimated. I warned Nathan in advance that we are acclimated to a speed round. So I'm going to take a minute we have a special LA speed round, especially for you today. And so let me get to there we go. I've got it all set up. So Dodgers or Angels?
Dodgers.
Okay.
Even though I grew up 2 miles from Anaheim Stadium.
Oh, so not near Chavez Ravine. So
No.
oh, okay, Dodgers and Angels. So all right, as a Giants fan, I'll give you a pass on that one.
All right.
And you have an outstanding new player to go watch next year.
Several, actually.
Yeah, well, yes, the checkbook is no problem. Okay, so true crime writers. I'm gonna give you two choices: Anne Rule or Truman Capote.
Truman Capote.
Yeah, I mean, so classic, right?
Yeah.
Okay, LA libraries. Now,
Ooh.
we're gonna have a stipulation that the OG is the LA Central Library. Okay, so we'll stipulate that. We're also not going to ask you to choose between your children, the Doheny or the Hoos. So we're gonna go new school: Manhattan Beach or Pico.
Oh wow. I'm sorry. I haven't been to either of those.
What?
Yeah.
Very well. When you come to Montana,
Yes.
which we hope will be soon, we'll ask you that question again.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you.
Okay. So Bob's Big Boy or In-N-Out?
Well, that's tough. We just did a Lost LA episode at Bob's Big Boy, and they were very generous, gracious hosts. But I love the double animal style, and so I have to go with In-N-Out.
Our past governor was famous for being able to order that, and people were very, very pleased about that. I have been accused by my children, if my hair is not behaving, I look like Bob's Big Boy. And then finally, OJ, guilty or not guilty?
Oh, guilty.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, okay. So thank you for playing our game. That's great. And Gracie, I think maybe at some point you're going to give me some contest winners. I've got two great prizes tonight. I have a from our friends at the Montana Coffee Traders, super cozy. Would have been really handy to have last week. Took, as they would call that in Canada. And then the Locale, which is a partner of ours, is making some really cool stuff. This is a headband, also great for the winner. So we're going to have two winners for that. But we still got some time to spend with Nathan Masters. Nathan, thanks again for being with us tonight. So what surprised you the most when you were going through this research that you said to yourself, I can't believe this is, you'd go see your wife and say, you can't believe what I just found?
Well, I mean, I was surprised from the very premise of the book, right? That the fact that something like this could happen, that's really how it got its hooks in me. The fact that the powers, the awesome powers of the Department of Justice to put people behind bars and to change their lives forever, that was abused in such a manner for naked political reasons. That really surprised me. I mentioned Calvin Coolidge. I was surprised by how much I came to like Calvin Coolidge. I knew going into it that I would probably come out liking Burton Wheeler, but Coolidge, not really. Yeah, those were the two big ones.
And Harding was an interesting character too, right? That he kind of became president because he was the best looking guy in a crowded room. And then kind of the things got swept up, I guess, for him.
Yeah. Everybody said that he looked just like a president, sounded just like a president, and he described his way of speaking as bloviating. He could speak. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is going. But he could speak 20 minutes about nonsense in ways that flattered the audience and that gestured towards American ideals, but never really said anything of substance. And the crowds, they ate it up. I mean, there's this scene in the book where his train is coming through Montana, and the crowds there adore him. But yeah, he got kind of carried away. He was a terrible president. I mean, he was completely detached from the actual, business of governance, right? He gave men like Harry Doherty free reign. I mean, he had some good cabinet members, right? His Treasury Secretary was okay. He had a competent Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, who was on the Supreme Court. But he also had some terrible cabinet picks and several scandals. I mean, one cabinet officer went to prison. Harry Doherty was another, barely escaped prison. He had a scandal brewing at the the Veterans Bureau. He was not personally, again, not personally complicit in any of the corruption, but he doesn't get a free pass because of that.
And we have, so you've got Lincoln to Roosevelt, and maybe with another Roosevelt in between, but there's kind of a fallow period. Do you think there's a connection between lack of leadership in the White House to the ability for corruption to take root in an administration?
Sure. Except that I guess my mind is now going to the Nixon presidency. And I mean, Nixon was not detached at all. I mean, he was a highly engaged, sometimes to the nation's benefit, but often not. And especially in the case of Watergate, where he he tried to maintain plausible deniability enough, but he was the one who directed all of the illegal operations that were run out of the West Wing of the White House. So not necessarily.
Right. So
Yeah.
what is it, do you think, about Wheeler that that allowed him to take this principled stand? And it's not the only time he did that, right? He's a complicated figure. But the picture behind me, right? He's there, but he and Roosevelt, I don't think actually maybe even spoke during this visit, because they weren't really on speaking terms some of the time. As you know, Wheeler basically stopped Roosevelt from stacking the United States Supreme Court. So as you went through this, what about Wheeler do you think gave him that ability to? Is it his prosecutorial background? Is it something about Montana? Is it about the time? What is it that gave him that ability to stand up and fight?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly I try to draw the courage that he mustered in Washington back to his experience in Montana. He'd seen it all, right? He'd gone up against people who played just as dirty as Harry Doherty, or even dirtier. So that was part of it. But he also had a lot of courage before he entered the Senate, when he was a state legislator, and he discovered to his dismay that he had been that his election had been engineered by the copper monopoly, sort of as a sop to the labor movement. But he refused to sort of play along with the corruption. I guess I never really answered that question to my satisfaction. I wonder, his legal training might have something to do with that, right? He took, I mean, all lawyers go through it, but some maybe take the ideals to heart more, and he certainly did. And maybe part of it was his Quaker, family history. Yeah, I don't know. It's a great question, though.
So, and maybe if any of the
Yes.
Wheeler great grandkids have an insight in that, it'd be great to kind of what did you see about your grandfather or great grandfather, if you knew him, that would educate to that. So feel free to unmute or pop something in the chat. So obviously you've got a room full of people who love this book. And so the obvious question that Dave has just asked is, so what's next?
Oh,
I mean,
well,
you spoke about Eric Larson, and we all do that with Eric Larson, I think.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. I've just sort of decided on a book topic. I don't know if I'm really quite comfortable talking about it yet. I don't really want to jinx anything, but what I will say is that it's about a completely different time period in a completely different part of the country, but I do think of it as a sort of successor in some way, not a sequel, but a successor to Crooked. J. Edgar Hoover is a character in it, for instance, and it sort of grew out of the thinking I did around the epilogue, where I was wrestling with the consequences of this investigation and how J. Edgar Hoover was left in charge of the FBI. And Hoover did, to his credit, really clean up the FBI and turn it into a modern law enforcement organization. But then he also really loved the domestic intelligence, the domestic spy agency aspect of the FBI too, and really overindulged in that quite a bit. So that's sort of where I'm headed, without giving too much away, with my next book.
Yeah, it's really I thought that was a really interesting part of the book too, how you have this young and up and comer, right, who really isn't anything yet, but because he's gotten himself in a place, the circumstances allow him to be vaulted to something that becomes truly historic.
Yeah, yeah, and the man who took over for Doherty as Attorney General, Harlan Fisk Stone, who was as upstanding Attorney General or judge or lawyer as you can find, misjudged, right? He misjudged Hoover. He thought, Hoover was sort of the ultimate political chameleon, and he was adept at staying in power, at saying what his superiors wanted to hear, and it worked with Stone. It worked with, what was it, 10 presidents? I mean, wow.
There's probably a tipping point where they had leverage and then he had leverage. So
That's exactly right. Yep.
yeah, I'm not sure when that tipping point happened for sure. But and let's go back to the park a little bit, and I want to explore this idea of this sense of place, right? I do think that any of us who spend a lot of time in special places, particularly for those of us on this call, like Glacier, there is something that changes in you when you do that, and it changes your vision of the world. You've also done some other, work in Lost LA about the outdoors and about how people experience that. We've seen this right now, this huge move toward people actually finding the outdoors through the time of COVID, et cetera. It feels to me like that's a good thing. It feels to me like Wheeler's being able to retreat to Glacier was a really positive thing to regenerate him, to see the fullness of what power and majesty really is, and to regenerate and repower that. As you go hiking with your family and work on your program in LA, one of the most congested places in the world, are you seeing any hope in that connectivity between place and our willingness to engage in a positive narrative in our world?
Wow.
How's that for a simple question?
Yeah, right. Well, I should lay out for everybody the fact that that I did during the pandemic move out of that one of those most congested parts of the world, to the mountains outside of Los Angeles. I live up in the San Jacinto Mountains. I certainly feel more spiritually connected to a landscape like that, or Montana. And for the record, I think I was telling you this, Doug, before we started, but I had grand plans to return. I did an archival research trip in the fall of 2019, and then I was going to return the next summer to do more archival research and visit the places that were important to Wheeler's life, like Butte and Lake McDonald. And of course, we all know what happened in the summer of 2020, or the spring of 2020. So that never happened. But I do hope to go out to Lake McDonald at some point. But yeah, there are places for me, like Yosemite National Park, a little bit closer than. I mean, Glacier is what, a 2 or 3 day drive from me, but I certainly know what you mean. Yeah, and boy, it does say something that these two, because we haven't talked a lot about Senator Walsh, but he was another like inspirational figure, completely different, right, in style from Senator Wheeler, but another figure that I found inspirational from this book. And yeah, there's something to be said for the fact that they shared a lakeshore.
Yeah, it's really a special. The Walsh homestead is no longer, and the Wheeler homestead, as we mentioned, was almost no longer. We had a major fire here recently that literally almost burned the structure down. It was saved because one of the volunteer rangers had noticed that the fire alarm needed a new battery. I kid you not. And without that battery and like a $10 fire extinguisher, we would not be we'd be having this discussion, but we'd be talking about the loss of the cabin. So You know, it's one of the privileges we have at the Conservancy to be able to kind of hear this story, hear the story of the Wheeler family, and then be able to do something about it. It's a really unique thing to be able to bring history alive again. And you've done that. You do that in your writing, right? And for us, this is a different way. So you're now part of the Glacier family. So we'll have to this is now just a matter of scheduling for you and your family to come up and spend some time with us. So you mentioned Eric Larson. What else is on your bedstand? What's the big stack of books that you're reading this year and looking at?
I do have that big stack that I suspect a lot of us do have. You know, there's a book. So Eric Larson does have a book coming out about Fort Sumter, actually, at the start of the Civil War. I'm looking forward to that. There's a great just since we're speaking about the genre of true crime, there's a great author, Dean Job, who specializes in swindlers, con artists. He has just some terrific books. There's another one coming out, A Gentleman and a Thief, quite soon, that I'm looking forward to. It takes place in the same time period as Crooked 2, the Jazz Age. It's Jazz Age New York. And aside from that, you know, I mentioned that I'm now starting on this next book, and we're already in development on another season of Lost LA. So I have just so much work reading. Unfortunately, you know, unfortunately, when I'm in the middle of these big projects, there's not a lot of pleasure reading to do. And it's one of the things I'm looking forward to when I finish the next book is sitting down with the books I really want to read. You know, can I go back to the whole idea of the cabin though? I think I mentioned this in the book. What I find interesting too is that Harry Doherty, right, the antagonist of the story, he had his own cabin. It was called the Shack in rural Ohio. Actually, along actually a really picturesque part of Ohio along a creek. Another place that I had hoped to go during the summer of 2020. But this was where sort of all of the backroom dealing was done. Sometimes these rustic retreats aren't always used for the best of purposes.
And especially these days when they may be the only place where you can't get you know, internet service, right? So
right.
You know, that's a whole different part. I mean, we don't have 3 hours to tear all this apart, but you know, also such a different time, right? That you know, there weren't cell phones and there weren't fax machines even, and so the whole interaction about these things took time, and weeks and months, and getting meetings together and physically being present, and that may be part of what allowed for some of this back and forth chasing down of Doherty, chasing down of Wheeler to happen. That must be interesting to do that research from the perspective of how things work today, to have to slow things down to how they worked in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the work couldn't happen if people weren't face to face. Although there were you know, telegrams back then, and actually you know, the senators and attorneys general made copious use of telegrams, and I found some. I mean, there's a lot of substance in those. And for instance, the Thomas Walsh papers, the Library of Congress, when he was finally zeroing in on what actually was going on with Teapot Dome, it was all by telegram with this investigative reporter for a Colorado newspaper. And yeah, a lot of work could still get done. I mean, those were sort of the emails or the text messages of the day, right?
Yeah. And again, there's another great Eric Larson book about you know, about the telegraph with the boat coming across. But
Marconi,
well,
yeah.
It's so neat to have you here. So before we let you go, what's the one kind of thing, as you think about us as advocates for history, as advocates for the national parks, what do you hope we take from your book and might be able to share with others?
Well, I think you've already hit on it, that places like the Wheeler cabin, that, you know, they have meaning only sort of because of the stories that they're connected to, right? Whether they're, well, you know, they could be the stories of the indigenous people who lived there long ago, or they could be the stories of I mean, you would probably, the average casual visitor to Glacier National Park would never expect that they might stumble on a cabin that is connected to this story. I mean, admittedly forgotten story, but the story that changed in Washington, that changed the way congressional investigations are done, right? And we see that, right, whether it's Adam Schiff or Jim Jordan, people are taking a page from Burton Wheeler's playbook, but that all kind of connects back to this one place on the Lake McDonald shoreline in Glacier National Park, and that's why places have meaning, is because of the stories they hold.
And great point about, you know, that takes different forms. It's Watergate in one era, it's red baiting in another era, it's Adam Schiff and it's Jim Jordan. But the standard for holding people accountable one way or another really does run through this investigation, and this senator, who even before he was sworn into office, right, was on this crusade to do what was right.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I think we all can thank him for doing that. The Justice Department and the FBI was on or the Bureau of Investigation was on a perilous path. You know, when the Bureau was created in 1908, everybody predicted that it would become a you know, czarist secret police force, and it was well on its way, but Doherty stopped it. So yeah.
Super interesting. Well, we have a couple of our key book clubbers from Cincinnati, Ohio. Eric and Tanya have noted that apparently you can rent the shack. So
I was going to, yeah, that was in, yeah, I hope to someday.
You can't rent the Wheeler cabin, but with any hope, either this fall or latest next summer, my goal is to be out there with all the Wheeler family and other supporters, and turn the key to the property and sit on the wicker furniture with the family and tell some stories. So, and you will get an invitation to that event, Nathan.
Thank you. I hope I can join you.
That's awesome. Well, Nathan Masters, thank you so much. We always promise that we keep people to time at 7:30, 9:30 for you, Robin. Thanks for staying up late. And we thank you all for joining. We'll be back in March. I'm really excited about our series of books this year, Tenacious Beasts in March. And then we're going to hear unbelievable ranger stories, Ranger Confidential in May. And it's going to be a terrific year. Thank you all for starting it off so well. And Nathan, again, thank you. And good night, everybody.